Hi, and welcome back to Tech 101. I'm Paul.
And I'm Gina, and our previous show took you inside the PC and showed you where the processor sits.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the processor, or CPU as it's also known.
Hey Paul, I just happen to have one right here.
Dude, that is so cool. It's so small. It's amazing to think that that tiny little chip does all those amazing things inside your computer.
But it hasn't always been this way. The first Intel processors back in 1971 were in calculators, and they were relatively big and simple. Over the years, processors have gotten progressively smaller, faster, and more complex. Now they're like microscopic megacities, and Intel processors are in everything from supercomputers to cell phones.
You know, the most impressive thing is about how much performance each successive generation has over the previous one.
That's because of something called Moore's Law.
You know, Gordon Moore was one of the Intel founders. Any relation?
Only in spirit, but someday if you're good, I'll tell you about Gina's Law.
Okay, Gina. I always hear people talk about that processor speed is important. If I just want a computer that works, should I really care?
What do you think?
Well, let's pretend that I don't have an opinion.
Pretend?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, an important concept to think about is clock speed.
Like an alarm clock.
Sort of, if you could speed up the alarm clock and things in the real world would go faster and faster. Kind of like cars on the freeway. The faster the clock, the faster things would move on the highway. In a computer, the processor has an internal clock that counts very quickly. It's measured in hertz, which is equivalent to cycles per second.
Okay, so 20 hertz is about 20 times per second.
Right, but a typical processor has a clock that counts at 2.4 gigahertz, which is 2.4 billion times per second.
Wow, that's fast.
You betcha. In a computer, the processor takes instructions from the operating system, software, and input devices. These instructions are packaged. The processor's speed determines how fast the instructions are carried out.
Okay, but does all that mean that a faster processor delivers better performance?
Not always. It depends on several factors. But the one thing you can count on is that if a certain processor comes in more than one clock speed, the one with the faster clock will do more work in the same amount of time.
Got it. Makes sense. Very smart.
Well, there's one thing to consider. Speed has consequences. Because the clock is moving so fast, the processor gets hot. So a few components in the computer help to cool the processor off as it's doing its thing. The processor snaps into the socket on a motherboard. A part called the heatsink sits on top of it and absorbs the heat. A fan sits on top of that. This system cools the processor and keeps it running its best. If you want to learn more about installing a processor, you can check out the Tech 101 homepage.
You know, Gina, I think we got a question from a viewer about a hot computer.
You're right, Paul.
Adam writes, how can I tell if my computer is overheating, and what do I do if it is?
It's a great question. Well, Adam, most processors will automatically shut down before they get too hot. If the system repeatedly shuts down and feels hot to the touch, this may be an indication that the processor or the system is overheating. It is very important to keep the fans on the computer free of dust and make sure the air vents are not blocked. This allows for proper airflow, which helps cool the processors. It is also a good idea to listen for the fans occasionally to make sure they're still running.
And if you are lucky enough to have one of the latest and greatest laptop models, you probably don't have a fan at all.
And if your processor is getting hot, contact your computer manufacturer. If you built the computer yourself, check out the Intel support website for help.
Well, that's all we have time for today. But before we go, remember, if you have questions about any topics we haven't covered, but you'd like to know more about, be sure to send them an email to the address on your screen. I'm Paul.
And I'm Gina, and we'll see you next time.